The sun-baked town of Copper Springs held its secrets like a miser clutches gold coins. Behind the painted storefronts and church steeples lay a web of power, greed, and broken promises. For 23 years, Eleanor Mason had called this dusty corner of Arizona Territory home, but as the daughter of the town's most indebted rancher, she was about to learn that in Copper Springs, freedom came with a price tag she never agreed to pay. When the aging Sheriff Walter Blackwood announced their engagement, Eleanor's world shattered. Her father had traded her future for his own salvation. What no one expected was the silent Navajo warrior watching from the shadows, a man with his own score to settle with the law of Copper Springs. This is a tale of courage that defies boundaries, of an unlikely alliance formed under the vast desert sky, and of a woman who discovered her strength only when everything was taken from her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The relentless Arizona summer had scorched everything in its path, turning the landscape surrounding Copper Springs into a canvas of rust and gold. Dust devils danced across Main Street, swirling between weathered buildings that seemed to sag under the weight of the afternoon heat. The cracked wooden sign above Mason's General Store swung in the hot breeze, its hinges protesting with each movement. Eleanor Mason stood behind the counter, her slender fingers working methodically to organize the new shipment of sewing supplies. Her chestnut hair was swept up in a practical bun, though rebellious tendrils had escaped to frame a face too striking to be called merely pretty. Her eyes, the color of sage after rainfall, surveyed the quiet store with resignation rather than interest. "Miss Mason, these buttons don't match what I ordered last month," Mrs. Holloway complained, her thin lips pursed in disapproval. "I specifically asked for pearls, not bone," Eleanor nodded apologetically, though she'd recorded the order correctly. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Holloway. The supplier must have made a mistake. I'll write to them immediately and request the proper items." "See that you do," the older woman sniffed. "Your father's store used to pride itself on reliability," Eleanor bit her tongue. The store had once been reliable, before her father, Thomas Mason, had begun his steady descent into gambling and whiskey, before the debts had piled higher than the Arizona mesas that surrounded their once prosperous ranch, before her mother's death 3 winters ago had untethered him from whatever restraint he once possessed. The bell above the door jingled as Mrs. Holloway departed, letting in a blast of hot air and the town's blacksmith, Ezra Quinn. "Afternoon, Eleanor," he greeted, removing his hat and revealing a shock of sandy hair. His face was kind, if plain, smudged with the honest dirt of his trade. "Hot enough for you?" She allowed herself a small smile. "Is it ever not, Ezra?" "Fair. Point." He placed a small list on the counter. "Need these supplies when you can. No rush." Their fingers brushed as she took the paper, and Ezra's face colored slightly. He'd been sweet on her for years, everyone in town knew it, but had never mustered the courage to speak plainly about his intentions. "I'll have these ready by tomorrow," she promised. "Much obliged." He hesitated, then added, "There's a social at the church Saturday evening. Thought maybe you might want to—" The door swung open again, cutting off Ezra's invitation as Sheriff Walter Blackwood entered the store. The air seemed to thicken around his substantial presence. At 58, Blackwood commanded the respect of Copper Springs through fear rather than admiration. His once powerful frame had softened with age and privilege, but the cold calculation in his pale blue eyes hadn't dimmed a fraction. The silver star pinned to his chest caught the light. As he moved, a reminder of the authority he wielded like a weapon. "Quinn," he acknowledged with a curt nod. "Don't you have horseshoes to bend?" Ezra's expression hardened, but he knew better than to challenge the sheriff. "Just heading back now. Good day, Eleanor." The younger man departed, leaving Eleanor alone with Blackwood, The sheriff removed his hat, revealing thinning grey hair slicked back with pomade. His gaze traveled over Eleanor in a way that made her skin crawl. "Miss Mason," he drawled, looking lovelier than a desert bloom after the rain. "Sheriff Blackwood," she replied, her voice neutral but cool. "What can I help you with today?" He chuckled, a sound like stones grinding against each other. "Always. Straight to business. That's what I admire about you, Eleanor. No nonsense." He placed a folded piece of paper on the counter. "Just my usual tobacco order, and perhaps a moment of your time." Eleanor reached for the list, but Blackwood's hand covered hers. His palm was hot and dry, like the desert floor. "I spoke with your father this morning," he said, watching her face carefully. "Had a very interesting conversation about the future of the Mason family." Eleanor gently extracted her hand. "Did you?" The familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. Conversations between her father and the sheriff never boded well. "Indeed. I believe he'll want to discuss it with you this evening." Blackwood stepped back, pleased with whatever reaction he'd detected in her expression. "I'll collect my order tomorrow. Good day, Eleanor." The bell jangled again as he left, and Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Outside the window, she watched Blackwood pause to speak with Reverend Phillips, both men glancing back at the store before continuing down the boardwalk. The afternoon crawled by, each tick of the wall clock bringing Eleanor closer to whatever news awaited her at home. At 5 o'clock, she locked the store and began the mile-long walk to the Mason ranch. Once the pride of the valley, the Mason property had deteriorated alongside its owner. The white paint on the two-story house had yellowed and peeled, exposing weathered wood beneath. Fence posts listed at odd angles, and what had once been lush grazing land was now patchy and overgrazed. Only Eleanor's determined efforts kept the vegetable garden producing and the remaining livestock fed. Her father's horse stood tethered at the front post, alongside another, a sleek, dapple grey with expensive tack that Eleanor recognized as belonging to Sheriff Blackwood. Her steps faltered, then resumed with grim resolve. Inside, the house smelled of whiskey and cigars. The two men sat in the parlor, Thomas Mason hunched in his armchair like a deflated version of his former self. At 49, he looked a decade older, his once handsome face mapped with broken blood vessels and lined by disappointment. His eyes, the same sage green as Eleanor's, were clouded and couldn't quite meet hers when she entered. "There she is," Sheriff Blackwood announced, rising to his feet. "The future Mrs. Blackwood." Eleanor froze, certain she had misheard. "Excuse me?" Thomas Mason cleared his throat. "Eleanor, sit down. Sheriff Blackwood has done us a great honor by asking for your hand." "My hand?" The words felt foreign in her mouth. "In marriage." "Of course, in marriage," her father snapped, irritation flaring through his discomfort. What else would he mean? Eleanor looked between the two men, searching for signs of a cruel joke. Finding none, she addressed Blackwood directly. "Sheriff, I'm flattered by your interest, but I must decline." Blackwood's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "I think you'll want to reconsider, Eleanor. Your father and I have already come to an arrangement." "An arrangement?" She turned to her father. "What kind of arrangement?" Thomas Mason took a long swallow from his glass before answering. "The sheriff has generously agreed to forgive my debts to him. All of them." His gaze slid away again. "In exchange for your hand in marriage." The room seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor's feet. "You're selling me? Like cattle?" "Don't be dramatic," her father muttered. "It's a good match. The sheriff can provide. For you, security, position in town." "I don't need a position," Eleanor said, her voice rising despite her efforts to control it. "And I certainly don't need to be traded away to secure it." Blackwood stepped forward, his bulk imposing in the small parlor. "Your father owes me over $2,000, Eleanor. Money he doesn't have. Without my generosity, he'd lose this ranch, what's left of it, and likely face time in territorial prison for fraud. Eleanor's gaze snapped to her father. Fraud? Thomas Mason sank deeper into his chair, guilt written in every line of his face. Blackwood continued, his voice smooth. As oil. I've also taken the liberty of settling his outstanding debts at the bank. The mortgage on your store is now in my name. He smiled, revealing teeth yellowed by tobacco. I'd hate to see you lose your livelihood as well as your home. Cold realization washed over Eleanor. This wasn't a proposal. It was extortion. When? She asked, the single word like ash in her mouth. The wedding will take place 3 weeks from Sunday, Blackwood replied, satisfaction evident in his tone. Reverend Phillips has already agreed to perform the ceremony. How considerate of him, Eleanor said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Blackwood reached out to touch her cheek, but she flinched away. If he noticed her revulsion, he didn't acknowledge it. You'll want for nothing as my wife, Eleanor. I've already ordered furniture from Chicago for the new house I'm building on Cottonwood Street. 3 bedrooms. His implication hung in the air, nauseating her. If you'll excuse me, she managed, I need some air. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Neither man moved to stop her as she fled the house, screen door slamming behind her. Eleanor walked blindly, past the barn, through the garden her mother had once tended, beyond the property line to where the land began its gentle rise toward the mesa. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in strokes of crimson and gold. In the distance, the sacred mountains of the Navajo nation were silhouetted against the deepening blue. Eleanor had always found solace in their ancient presence, their silent witness to countless human struggles. She sank to her knees in the dust, pressing her palms against her eyes to stem the tears that threatened. She would not cry. Crying solved nothing. Eleanor had watched her mother fade away after years of enduring Thomas Mason's failings, his gambling, his drinking, his endless broken promises. Sarah Mason had died believing things would improve, that her husband would find his way back to the man she'd married. Eleanor had no such illusions. As darkness fell around her, she became aware of a presence. Instinct made her still, and she listened intently. The night sounds continued undisturbed, the chittering of insects, the distant howl of a coyote, but something had changed in the atmosphere. Slowly, Eleanor rose to her feet and turned. At first, she saw nothing but shadows. Then, a figure detached itself from the darkness of a juniper tree. A man stood perhaps 20 yards away, watching her. He was tall, his long black hair held back with a band at the nape of his neck. Even in the dim light, she could see he was Navajo, his features strong and proud, his bearing unlike the reservation Indians who sometimes came to trade at the store. Fear should have been her first reaction, but something in his stillness kept her rooted to the spot. He made no move toward her, no threatening gesture. He simply watched, as if assessing her presence on the land as carefully as she was assessing his. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the distance. Then, with a slight inclination of his head, acknowledgement rather than deference, he stepped backward and seemed to melt into the darkness. Eleanor stared at the spot where he had stood, wondering if exhaustion and distress had conjured a vision. But the impression of those dark, intelligent eyes remained too vivid to dismiss. The distant sound of her father calling her name broke the spell. Slowly, she turned back toward the house, her mind working rapidly. In 3 weeks, she would be forced to marry Walter Blackwood, to share his bed, to bear his children. The thought made bile rise in her throat. She had 3 weeks to find a way out. Back at the house, Sheriff Blackwood had gone, leaving Thomas Mason slumped in his chair, a fresh bottle of whiskey open beside him. There you are, he slurred. Thought. You'd run off. Where would I go? Eleanor asked quietly, though the question had taken on new urgency in her mind. Her father waved a hand vaguely. Your mother always threatened, never went anywhere. He took another drink. You're a good girl, Eleanor. Better than I deserve. That's not difficult, father. He winced at her tone, but didn't argue the point. The sheriff will treat you well. He's got money, influence. He's old enough to be my father, Eleanor replied, and cruel enough to use debt to force a woman into marriage. What kind of man does that make him? A practical one, Thomas Mason muttered. No different than arrangements, made since the beginning of time. Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the darkness that had swallowed the landscape. Somewhere out there, the Navajo man might still be watching. The thought wasn't as unsettling as it should have been. I'm going to bed, she announced, not trusting herself to continue the conversation without saying things that couldn't be unsaid. Her father nodded absently, already lost in his bottle. It'll be better in the morning, you'll see. But as Eleanor climbed the stairs to her small bedroom, she knew nothing would improve by daylight. Sheriff Blackwood would still own her father's debts. The wedding date would still loom. Her life, which had never been entirely her own, was now being bartered away completely. She sat at the small desk by her window and pulled out a sheet of paper. By the light of a single candle, she began to list her options, as her mother had taught her to do when facing a difficult decision. She could marry Blackwood and surrender to a life of servitude to a man she despised. She could refuse and watch. Her father go to prison, lose the ranch, the store, everything they had left. She could run. But where? With what money? A single woman traveling alone invited dangers possibly worse than marriage to Blackwood. She could end her life, a thought that flickered briefly before she dismissed it. Her mother had raised her to be stronger than that. As the candle burned lower, Eleanor's resolve hardened. She would not be a victim. She would not passively accept the future being forced upon her. Somehow, some way, she would find a path to freedom. Outside her window, an owl called into the night, its haunting cry echoing across the desert. And somewhere in that vast darkness, Eleanor sensed, was an answer she had yet to discover. In the morning, light slanted through the curtains, rousing Eleanor from fitful sleep. The reality of her situation settled over her anew, but with it came determination rather than despair. She dressed quickly, in her simplest work dress, and headed downstairs. As expected, her father was absent, likely having left for town and the comfort of the saloon as soon as he'd woken. Eleanor went about her morning chores with mechanical efficiency, her mind working on a problem that seemed to have no solution. As she drew water from the well for the garden, a flicker of movement caught her eye. At the edge of the property, just where the juniper trees began to thicken, stood the Navajo man from the night before. This time, she could see him clearly in the morning light. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 30, with a face that spoke of hardship and resilience. He wore a simple cotton shirt and trousers that appeared to be of white man's make, but around his neck hung a silver and turquoise pendant that was unmistakably Navajo. He carried no visible weapon, yet everything about him suggested a man who knew how to survive. Their eyes met across the distance, and Eleanor felt a strange jolt of recognition, though she was certain they had never spoken. He raised his hand slowly, not a greeting, but a gesture that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and warning. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he was gone, leaving Eleanor with the unsettling feeling that her life had just shifted in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The week following Sheriff Blackwood's announcement passed in a blur of forced smiles and hollow congratulations. Word of the engagement spread through Copper Springs like wildfire, transforming Eleanor from the respected shopkeeper's daughter to an object of curiosity and whispered speculation. Women who had barely acknowledged her existence now stopped. By the store with transparent excuses, their eyes hungry for details about the upcoming nuptials. "How fortunate you are, dear," Mrs. Peterson gushed as she lingered over a selection of calico. "Sheriff Blackwood is quite the catch." Eleanor measured out 3 yards of fabric, her face a careful mask. "Is he?" "Oh my, yes. A man of his standing. Taking an interest in—" Mrs. Peterson caught herself, but her meaning hung in the air. A man of his standing, taking an interest in the daughter of a fallen, indebted rancher. "Will you be wanting a thread to match?" Eleanor asked, cutting through the awkward silence. By Thursday afternoon, the pretense had become nearly unbearable. Eleanor stood behind the counter, mechanically recording inventory in the ledger, when the bell above the door announced yet another visitor. She looked up to find Ezra Quinn, the blacksmith, standing awkwardly in the doorway, his hat clutched in calloused hands. "Afternoon, Eleanor," he said, his usual easy manner replaced by stiff formality. "Ezra." She managed a small smile. "Do you need more supplies?" He shook his head, stepping closer to the counter. "I came to see how you're doing, with the news and all." Something in his genuine concern cracked her carefully constructed facade. "How do you think I'm doing?" Ezra glanced over his shoulder, to ensure they were alone, then lowered his voice. "I think you're being traded like livestock, and I think it's wrong." The blunt assessment, so closely matching her own thoughts, startled a harsh laugh from Eleanor. "That's exactly what's happening." "You don't have to go through with it," Ezra said, a flush rising to his cheeks. "There are other options." Eleanor's pencil stilled over the ledger. "Such as?" Ezra took a deep breath. "You could marry me instead." For a moment, Eleanor could only stare at him, uncomprehending. Ezra Quinn had been her friend since childhood. He was kind, hard-working, and honest. Everything Sheriff Blackwood was not. But she had never thought of him as more than a friend, and the desperation in his eyes told her this was no romantic proposal. "Ezra, I know it's not what you dreamed of," he hurried on, "but I've got my business, the house my father left me. It wouldn't be much, but you'd be free of Blackwood." The sincerity of his offer touched her deeply. "You'd do that for me? Marry without love?" "I've cared for you a long time, Eleanor," he admitted. "Maybe not the way stories talk about, but enough to not want to see you suffer. We could build something real in time." Before she could respond, the door swung open again. Sheriff Blackwood filled the frame, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. "Afternoon, Eleanor," he said, pointedly ignoring Ezra. "I've come to escort you to the dressmaker. Mrs. Holloway is expecting us." Ezra stiffened, but didn't back down. "We were in the middle of a conversation, Sheriff." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Were you now? Well, I'm sure whatever blacksmith business you have can wait. My fiancé has an appointment." The territorial claim in his voice made Eleanor's skin crawl. "I wasn't aware we had an appointment, Sheriff." "Walter," he corrected, his tone gentle, but his eyes hard. "We're to be married, Eleanor. Sheriff seems awfully formal between us now." He extended his arm. "Shall we?" Ezra looked at Eleanor, waiting for her signal. She wanted to refuse, to finish their conversation, to explore the lifeline he had thrown her. But the weight of her father's debts and the calculating look in Blackwood's eyes held her in place. "Let me get my shawl," she said quietly. When Eleanor returned from the back room, Ezra was gone, and Blackwood stood examining a display of pocket watches, his back to her. "Ready?" he asked without turning. "Yes." The word tasted like surrender. Outside, Blackwood's carriage waited, a sleek black conveyance that seemed to emphasize his wealth and position. He handed her up, his grip on her elbow firmer than necessary, then settled beside her with uncomfortable proximity. "I don't appreciate Quinn sniffing around what's mine," he said casually as the carriage began to move. Eleanor bristled. "I'm not yours yet." "No." Blackwood placed his hand on her knee, the weight of it oppressive through her skirts. "Your father's debt transfers to me upon our marriage. One word from me, and he could be on a prison wagon by sundown. I'd say that makes you as good as mine already." Eleanor moved her knee away, but the carriage was too small to create meaningful distance. "Why me? There are widows in town who would welcome your attention. Younger daughters from better families." Blackwood studied her face, something predatory in his gaze. "None of them have your fire, Eleanor. You're not beaten down like the rest of them. Breaking a spirit like yours. Now that's something a man remembers." The casual cruelty of his words stole Eleanor's breath. This wasn't just about convenience or settling debts. This was about power, about possession, about breaking something wild simply because it existed. The carriage rolled to a stop outside Mrs. Holloway's dress shop, but before Eleanor could exit, Blackwood caught her wrist. "One more thing," he said, his voice low. "I heard about your little nighttime wanderings at the edge of your property. That's going to stop immediately. It's not proper for my future wife to be out alone after dark." The implication was clear. He had been watching her, or having her watched. Even the small freedom of solitary walks was being stripped away. "Do I make myself clear?" His thumb pressed against the pulse point in her wrist. "Perfectly," Eleanor managed. Mrs. Holloway's fitting room felt like a prison cell. Eleanor stood on a low platform, surrounded by mirrors that reflected her pale face and rigid posture from every angle. The wedding dress, commissioned without her input, was being pinned and tucked around her by Mrs. Holloway and her assistant. "Such fine fabric," Mrs. Holloway murmured, running her fingers over the ivory. "Satin." Sheriff Blackwood spared no expense. From his seat in the corner, Blackwood nodded in satisfaction. "Only the best for my bride." Eleanor stared at her reflection, a stranger in white. The dress was objectively beautiful, with its high collar, fitted bodice, and cascade of tiny pearl buttons down the back. It was also a cage, each stitch binding her more tightly to a future she desperately wanted to escape. "Perhaps a bit more taken in at the waist," Blackwood suggested, rising to circle Eleanor like a predator. "I like a woman with proper shape." Mrs. Holloway nodded obsequiously and began adjusting pins. Eleanor closed her eyes, fighting the urge to tear the dress from her body and run. The fitting lasted an interminable hour, during which Blackwood dictated changes to the neckline, the sleeves, the hem, each alteration claiming more of Eleanor's autonomy. When it was finally over, she changed back into her simple work dress. With trembling fingers, refusing the assistant's help, Blackwood was waiting when she emerged, standing too close, smelling of tobacco and cologne. "I have business to attend to at the sheriff's office," he said. "Mrs. Holloway will escort you back to the store." It was a small mercy that Eleanor didn't question. "Thank you." His hand cupped her cheek, thumb brushing across her lower lip. "I'll call you this evening. Your father and I have some paperwork to finalize." Eleanor nodded mutely, unable to form words with his touch violating her personal space. Mrs. Holloway accompanied Eleanor back to the store, chattering endlessly about wedding preparations, receptions, and the house Blackwood was building. Eleanor barely heard her, her mind racing with increasingly desperate scenarios for escape. When they reached Mason's general store, Eleanor was startled to find a customer waiting outside, a Navajo woman with a young child clinging to her skirts. Both were dressed poorly, the woman's long skirt dusty from travel, her face lined with fatigue. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Holloway said, making no effort to lower her voice. "We don't open for Indians after 4. The Navajo woman's expression didn't change, but her hand tightened on her child's shoulder. "Nonsense," Eleanor said sharply. "I'm open until 5 for everyone." She unlocked the door, ignoring Mrs. Holloway's disapproving cluck. "Well, I'll leave you to it then," the dressmaker said stiffly. "The dress will be ready for a final fitting next week." Eleanor nodded absently, holding the door for the Navajo woman and child. Once inside, she locked it behind them, flipping the sign to closed. The woman spoke hesitantly in broken English. "Medicine for boys, fever." Eleanor's gaze dropped to the child, a boy of perhaps 6 or 7. His eyes were glassy with fever, his small body trembling despite the warmth of the day. "How long has he been sick?" she asked, kneeling to feel the boy's forehead. It burned against her palm. The woman made a gesture indicating several days. "No money, trade." She held out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Eleanor unwrapped it to find a beautifully woven bracelet, its pattern intricate and its craftsmanship exquisite. It was worth far more than any medicine she could provide. "Wait here," she said. In the back room, Eleanor kept a cabinet of medicinal herbs and tinctures, knowledge gleaned from her mother, who had learned from an old Mexican curandera, who once lived on the outskirts of town. Thomas Mason dismissed it as women's nonsense, and Sheriff Blackwood had made his disdain for Indian remedies clear. But Eleanor had seen these treatments work when the town doctor's mercury and bloodletting failed. She returned with willow, bark for the fever, echinacea tincture for infection, and a small jar of honey mixed with herbs to soothe the boy's raw throat. Carefully she demonstrated how to prepare and administer each remedy. The woman watched intently, repeating Eleanor's instructions under her breath. When Eleanor handed her the supplies, the woman tried again to give her the bracelet. "No," Eleanor said gently, closing the woman's fingers back around her offering. "Keep it." The woman's dark eyes studied Eleanor's face. Then deliberately, she removed the bracelet from the cloth and pressed it into Eleanor's hand. "For spirit," she said, touching her own chest. "Strong spirit, like a mountain." Moved by the gesture, Eleanor slipped the bracelet onto her wrist. "Thank you." The woman nodded, gathered her supplies and her son, and moved toward the door. Before leaving, she turned back. "You watch. They come." "Who comes?" Eleanor asked, confused. The woman's expression was impossible to read. "The Shadow Walker. He sees you." With that cryptic statement, she slipped out the door, leaving Eleanor alone with a sense of foreboding that clung to her like desert dust. That night, Sheriff Blackwood and Thomas Mason sequestered themselves. In the ranch house's small study, the scratch of pens and murmur of male voices drifting under the closed door. Eleanor moved restlessly through the kitchen, preparing a dinner no one had asked for, keeping her hands busy to stop them from shaking. When the men finally emerged, her father looked relieved, his shoulders lighter than Eleanor had seen in months. Blackwood's expression was that of a man who had closed a profitable business deal. "It's all settled," Thomas announced, pouring himself a celebratory whiskey. "Walter has taken care of everything. The banknote, my debts at Carter's saloon, even that business with Jackson over the cattle sale." "How generous," Eleanor said, flatly, setting plates on the table with more force than necessary. Blackwood smiled, reaching for her hand across the table. "Family takes care of family, Eleanor. Soon enough, your father's burdens will be mine to bear." "And I'll be your burden instead," she replied, pulling her hand away. Thomas Mason's face flushed with anger. "That's enough, Eleanor. Walter is saving this family from ruin. Show some gratitude." "Gratitude?" The word erupted from her like steam from a geyser. "For being sold to pay your gambling debts. For having my future decided without my consent. For being handed to a man old enough to be my father because you couldn't control your vices." "Eleanor." Her father half rose from his chair. But Blackwood placed a restraining hand on his arm. "It's all right, Thomas," the sheriff said smoothly. "Pre-wedding nerves are to be expected. Eleanor will come to appreciate the arrangement in time." His cold gaze belied his conciliatory tone. "Though a wife should remember her place, especially when her husband is being so accommodating." The threat in his words was unmistakable. Eleanor looked between the two men, one weak with addiction and self-pity, the other calculating and controlling, and something inside her hardened into resolve. "Excuse me," she said, her voice suddenly calm. "I need some air." Before either man could object, she was out the door, moving swiftly toward the barn. Inside, she leaned against a stall door, gulping in the familiar scents of hay and horses, trying to order her thoughts. The family's aging mare, Penny, nickered softly and pushed her nose against Eleanor's shoulder. "What am I going to do, old girl?" Eleanor whispered, stroking the horse's velvety muzzle. "There's no way out." A soft sound from the hayloft above made her freeze. Slowly, Eleanor looked up, heart hammering against her ribs. A man dropped silently to the barn floor, the same Navajo man she had seen watching her before. Up close, he was even more imposing, tall and lean, with the quiet strength of a mountain lion. The silver and turquoise pendant around his neck caught the fading light from the barn window. Eleanor backed away, searching frantically for a weapon. Her hand closed around a pitchfork leaning against the wall. "Stay back," she warned, raising it defensively. The man made no move toward her. "I am not here to harm you," he said, his English clear and precise, with only a slight accent. "My name is Key Benally. I've been watching Sheriff Blackwood. And you." Eleanor kept the pitchfork raised. "Why?" "Because Blackwood is a danger to my people and yours," he replied simply. "And because you need help." The directness of his statement caught Eleanor off guard. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you're being forced to marry a man you fear," Key said. "I know your father trades your future for his debts. I know you are searching for a way out that doesn't exist in Copper Springs." Each sentence struck with the precision of an arrow finding its mark. Eleanor lowered the pitchfork slightly, studying him more carefully. He wore white man's clothes, but his long hair and bearing spoke of his heritage. A thin scar ran along, his jawline disappearing beneath his collar. "How do you speak English so well?" she asked, deflecting from the uncomfortable accuracy of his observations. "Government school in Santa Fe," he answered, a shadow crossing his face. "They tried to make me forget who I am. They failed." The bitterness in his voice resonated with something in Eleanor. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing." Key stepped to the side, giving her clear access to the barn door. "But I can offer you what you want most. Freedom." The word hung in the air. Between them, tantalizing and impossible. "How?" Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "Blackwood has enemies beyond Copper Springs. People seeking justice for crimes he's committed against the Navajo. I work with them." Key's dark eyes held hers steadily. "In 3 days, I leave for the mountains north of here. You could come." Eleanor's mind reeled at the suggestion. "You're asking me to run away with a stranger, to abandon everything I know." "I'm offering you a choice," he corrected. "Stay and become property, or leave and find your own path." From the house, Eleanor heard the front door slam, followed by her father's voice calling her name. Key melted back into the shadows of the barn. 3 days, he said softly. "If you decide to come, leave a white cloth tied to the juniper tree where we first saw each other. I'll find you." Then he was gone, slipping out the back of the barn like a shadow at dusk, leaving Eleanor with the echo of possibility ringing in her ears and her father's increasingly angry calls from the house. She replaced the pitchfork with trembling hands, trying to process what had just happened. A Navajo man, a stranger, had offered her escape. It was madness to even consider it. Yet as she walked slowly back to the house, where Sheriff Blackwood waited to claim her future, the silver bracelet felt warm against her wrist, and the word freedom beat in her veins like a second pulse. The following morning, Eleanor went through her duties at the store with mechanical precision, her mind elsewhere. She opened crates, stocked shelves, and assisted customers, while Key Benally's offer echoed in her thoughts. Freedom, a concept that had seemed increasingly distant with each passing day, now hovered just beyond her grasp, both tempting and terrifying. "You seem distracted today," Martha Collins observed, as Eleanor miscounted her change for the third time. Eleanor managed a weak smile. "Just wedding preparations on my mind." Martha, one of the few women in town who had always treated Eleanor with genuine kindness, lowered her voice. "Is there anything I can do to help, with the situation?" The hesitation in Martha's voice made it clear she understood more than she let on. Eleanor glanced around to ensure they were alone. "What have you heard?" she asked quietly. Martha's kind eyes reflected concern. "People talk. Sheriff Blackwood has a reputation, and not just with the law. His first wife died under unclear circumstances." A chill ran through Eleanor. "What do you mean?" The official story was pneumonia, but Sarah Jenkins, she was their housekeeper, said there were bruises, dark ones. Martha laid a gentle hand on Eleanor's arm. "I shouldn't speak ill, but you deserve to know what you're walking into." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Thank you for telling me." After Martha left, Eleanor leaned heavily against the counter, her decision suddenly crystallizing. Perhaps fleeing with the Navajo stranger was reckless, but remaining to become Blackwood's wife now seemed like certain destruction. The bell above the door chimed, and Eleanor looked up to find Ezra Quinn entering, his expression grave. "I need to speak with you," he said without preamble. "Privately." Eleanor flipped the sign to closed and led him to the small office at the back of the store. "What's wrong?" "Blackwood knows," Ezra said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About my proposal to you." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "How?" "I don't know. But he cornered me at the forge this morning, made it clear what would happen if I continued to interfere." Ezra pushed up his sleeve to reveal angry bruises where strong fingers had gripped his arm. "He said he'd make sure I lost the smithy. Said accidents happen all the time when you work with fire." Guilt and fear twisted in Eleanor's stomach. "Ezra, I'm so sorry. This is my fault." He shook his head firmly. "No, it's his. Eleanor, you need to be careful. The man is dangerous when he feels his possessions are threatened." "I'm not his possession," she said reflexively, though the paperwork signed the previous night suggested otherwise. "No, you're not," Ezra agreed, "which is why I want you to take this." He pressed a small leather pouch into her hand. "It's not much, just my savings from the past few months, but it might help if you decide to—" He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. Ezra was giving her money to run. Eleanor swallowed hard. "I can't take this." "You can, and you will." His eyes held hers with surprising intensity. "I'm not in a position to offer more help, not with Blackwood watching me. But this might give you a chance." She clutched the pouch, overcome with gratitude for this small act of rebellion, this seed of possibility. "Thank you." Ezra nodded once, then straightened his shoulders. "I should go. Be careful, Eleanor." After he left, Eleanor counted the money. With trembling fingers, $28, a small fortune by her standards. Combined with the $12 she had secretly saved from the store's earnings, it might be enough to start somewhere new. If she dared to leave, the rest of the day crawled by. Each customer, another reminder of the life she was contemplating, abandoning. Mrs. Peterson with her endless gossip, old Mr. Simmons, who always bought the same 3 items each week, the Wilkins children who saved pennies for candy sticks. These people had been the backdrop of her existence for as long as she could remember. Could she really leave it all behind on the word of a stranger? As she was closing up for the day, a figure appeared in the doorway. Sheriff Blackwood, his bulk silhouetted against the setting sun. "Locking up early?" he asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Eleanor steadied her nerves. "It's 5 o'clock, regular closing time." Blackwood made a show of checking his pocket watch. "So it is." He moved closer, running a finger along the edge of the counter. "I thought I might escort you home this evening. Your father mentioned you've been taking your time lately." The implication was clear. Her movements were being monitored, her independence, further restricted. "That's thoughtful of you," she said, keeping her voice neutral as she gathered her shawl. Blackwood offered his arm with exaggerated gallantry. Eleanor had no choice but to take it, his solid forearm a reminder of the physical power he held over her. They walked in silence for a time, the usual bustle of Copper Springs winding down as shop owners closed up and miners returned from their shifts. Several townspeople nodded respectfully to the sheriff, their eyes sliding curiously to Eleanor, before quickly looking away. "I had a most interesting conversation with your blacksmith friend today," Blackwood said casually as they passed. "The church." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her face impassive. "Oh? Young Quinn seemed to have some misunderstandings about your availability." Blackwood's grip on her arm tightened imperceptibly. "I set him straight, of course." "Ezra is an old friend," Eleanor said carefully. "Nothing more." "See that it stays that way." Blackwood stopped walking, turning her to face him. "I don't share what's mine, Eleanor, not with overeager blacksmiths, not with anyone." The possessiveness in his voice made her skin crawl, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "The wedding isn't for another 2 weeks. I'm not yours yet." Something dangerous flickered in his pale eyes. "Aren't you?" Before she could respond, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I was going to save this for Sunday dinner, but perhaps you need a reminder of our arrangement." He opened the box to reveal a gold ring set with a blood-red ruby surrounded by small diamonds. It was ostentatious and cold, like the man himself. "It's beautiful," Eleanor lied. "It was my mother's," Blackwood said, removing the ring from its box. "She wore it for 40 years of loyal marriage to my father." He took Eleanor's left hand in his grip firm enough to prevent withdrawal. "This makes it official in the eyes of the town. No more confusion about your status." The ring slid onto her finger, heavier than its physical weight warranted. Eleanor stared at it, the ruby like a drop of blood against her skin. "Thank you," she managed. Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Wear it always. I'll know if you don't." The remainder of the walk passed in tense silence, Blackwood's arm now possessively around her waist. Eleanor felt each step taking her deeper into a life she increasingly knew she could not survive. At the ranch house, Thomas Mason greeted them with forced joviality, his eyes lighting on the ring immediately. "Well now, that's a fine piece," he said, pouring whiskey for Blackwood without offering any to Eleanor. "A proper engagement ring for my daughter." "I thought it time to make things official," Blackwood replied, accepting the drink. "Especially given some misunderstandings in town." Thomas shot Eleanor a suspicious glance. "What misunderstandings?" "Nothing worth discussing," Blackwood said smoothly. "All resolved now." Eleanor excused herself to prepare dinner, escaping to the kitchen, where she could breathe without Blackwood's suffocating presence. The ring felt like a shackle on her finger. She twisted it, tempted to remove it the moment she was alone. But Blackwood's warning echoed in her mind. "I'll know if you don't." Dinner was an exercise in restraint. Eleanor served the men, answered when spoken to, and kept her eyes downcast, while Blackwood and her father discussed wedding details as if she weren't present. The sheriff would provide the food and drink. Thomas would ensure the church was prepared. The honeymoon would be a brief trip to Phoenix before Blackwood needed to return to his duties. Eleanor's future mapped out neatly without her input or consent. After the meal, Blackwood lingered, clearly expecting to be invited to stay longer. Eleanor busied herself with clearing dishes until her father finally called her to the parlor. "Walter has something to discuss with us," Thomas said, his speech already slurred from too much whiskey. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and sat stiffly in the chair farthest from Blackwood, who stood by the fireplace like he already owned. "The house. I've been thinking," Blackwood began, swirling his drink, that waiting 2 more weeks is unnecessary. The arrangements are in place, the dress nearly finished. We could move the wedding to this Sunday. Eleanor's breath caught. This Sunday? That's only 3 days away. Precisely, Blackwood smiled thinly. No reason to delay our happiness, is there? Thomas nodded eagerly. Makes good sense to me. The sooner you're settled, the better. I thought. The banns needed to be read for 3 consecutive Sundays, Eleanor said, grasping at any excuse. It's church law. Reverend Phillips has agreed to waive the requirement, Blackwood replied, given the special circumstances. The walls seemed to close in around Eleanor. She had been counting on those 2 weeks to plan, to decide, to gather courage. Now her time had been cut short deliberately, as if Blackwood sensed her wavering commitment. I'm not sure the dress will be ready, she stammered. Mrs. Holloway assured me it would be, Blackwood countered smoothly. I spoke with her this afternoon. Of course he had. He had anticipated every objection, closed every avenue of delay. Then it's settled, Thomas declared, oblivious to his daughter's distress. Sunday it is, Blackwood raised his glass in a toast, to Sunday and new beginnings. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She packed her small bedroom, the reality of her situation pressing in from all sides. Blackwood had accelerated the wedding, effectively giving her less than 3 days to decide her fate, the same timeline Key Bennerly had given her. It couldn't be a coincidence. Either Blackwood somehow knew about the Navajo man's offer, or fate was forcing her hand with cruel efficiency. As dawn broke over the eastern mountains, Eleanor made her decision. She would meet with Key once more, learn what escape truly entailed, and then choose. She needed more information before committing to such a drastic step. The store was unusually busy that morning, as if the entire town had suddenly developed urgent needs for dry goods. Eleanor suspected the real draw was the ruby ring on her finger and the gossip about the accelerated wedding date, which had spread overnight with typical small-town efficiency. "This Sunday!" Mrs. Peterson exclaimed, examining the ring without invitation. "My goodness, such a rush. One might think there was a special reason." Her eyes dropped meaningfully to Eleanor's midsection. Eleanor pulled her hand away. "The sheriff is eager to settle into married life. I'm sure he is," Mrs. Peterson replied, with a knowing smile that made Eleanor's cheeks burn with indignation. By midday, she was desperate for escape. When Martha Collins arrived to purchase thread, Eleanor seized the opportunity. "Martha, could you watch the store for an hour? I need to deliver some medicine to the Morgan farm. Their youngest has a fever." It was a lie, but Martha agreed readily, her eyes full of sympathy. "Take all the time you need, dear." Eleanor gathered a basket as if preparing a delivery, then slipped out the back door and headed not toward the Morgan farm, but to the juniper grove at the edge of her father's property. Her heart raced with each step, fear and anticipation building in equal measure. She found no sign of Key in the grove, but somehow knew he was nearby, watching. The sensation of being observed had become familiar over the past week. "I know you're there," she called, keeping her voice low but firm. "I need to speak with you." For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, like a shadow detaching from deeper darkness, Key emerged from behind a large boulder. He wore the same clothes as before, but a knife was now visible at his belt, and something in his stance suggested readiness for trouble. "You shouldn't be here in daylight," he said without greeting. "Blackwood has men watching." "I know," Eleanor replied. "He's moved the wedding to Sunday." Key's expression remained impassive, but his eyes narrowed slightly. 3 days from now?" "Yes. The same deadline you gave me." She studied his face closely. "Did you know this would happen?" "I suspected he would try to claim you more quickly once he sensed resistance," Key said. "Men like Blackwood don't tolerate challenges to their authority." Eleanor paced the small clearing, the ruby ring catching sunlight with each movement of her hand. I need to know more before I decide. Where would we go? What would happen to my father? Your father made his choice when he sold you to pay his debts, Key said bluntly. As for where we would go, north to the mountains above Flagstaff first, then further if needed. There are places the law doesn't reach. And then what? Eleanor pressed. What kind of life would I have? A white woman alone among the Navajo? You? Wouldn't be among my people, not at first, Key clarified. There are others like you, settlers who left their old lives behind. Some run from the law, others from situations like yours. Fugitives and outcasts, Eleanor said softly. Free people, Key corrected, making their own way without being owned. Eleanor touched the heavy ring on her finger. And you? What's your interest in helping me? Something flickered across Key's stoic features, a shadow of old pain quickly. Controlled. Blackwood isn't just a danger to you. 2 years ago, he led a raid on a Navajo settlement near the territorial border, claimed they were horse thieves. 8 people died, including my sister and her husband. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. I didn't know. Few do. The territorial papers reported it as justice served upon Indian raiders. Bitterness edged Key's voice. There were no horses stolen. The land they lived on had silver beneath it. Blackwood has interests in the mining company that now operates there. The revelation struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She had known Blackwood was cruel, controlling, potentially violent, but this was calculated evil of another magnitude. So this is about revenge, she said, understanding Dawn. You're using me to hurt him. Key met her gaze directly. Would that change your decision? If freedom came with the knowledge that you were causing pain to the man who bought you like cattle? The question hung between them, challenging and honest. Eleanor considered it carefully. No, she finally admitted. It wouldn't change my decision, but I needed to know the truth of what I'm walking into. Then here is more truth, Key said, stepping closer. Leaving will not be easy. The journey is dangerous. Blackwood will hunt you, us, with everything. He has. You may never return to a life like the one you know. The life I know is disappearing anyway, Eleanor replied, twisting the ruby ring on her finger. Key's eyes dropped to the movement, his expression hardening. His mark. He brands what he believes he owns. Eleanor slid the ring off suddenly, the weight of it offensive in her palm. I didn't choose this, but you can choose what comes next, Key said quietly. A twig snapped in the distance, and Key's posture immediately shifted, alert and wary. Someone's coming. You should go. Eleanor nodded, slipping the ring reluctantly back onto her finger. I need to think. You have until tomorrow night, Key said. If you decide to come, tie a white cloth to this tree and be ready at midnight. Pack only what you can carry on horseback. And if I don't come, Key's expression was unreadable. Then I hope your cage is more comfortable than my sister's grave. The harsh words followed Eleanor back to town, echoing with each step. By the time she reached the store, Martha was dealing with a line of customers, all of whom turned to stare as Eleanor entered with wind-blown hair and flushed cheeks. There. You are, Martha exclaimed with forced brightness. How are the Morgans doing? Better, Eleanor lied, quickly taking her place behind the counter. Thank you for watching things. The afternoon dragged endlessly, filled with curious customers and thinly veiled questions about the wedding. Eleanor answered mechanically, her mind elsewhere, in the mountains north of Flagstaff, in a life she could barely imagine. When she finally closed the store and headed home, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and crimson. The beauty of it struck her anew, as if she was seeing the Arizona sky for the first time, or perhaps the last. At the ranch house, she found her father sitting on the porch, a rare moment of sobriety rendering him pensive. You're late, he observed as she climbed the steps. "The store was busy," she replied, pausing beside his chair. "Everyone's curious about the wedding." Thomas nodded absently, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Your mother would have known how to handle all this better. The arrangements, the preparations." The unexpected mention of her mother caught Eleanor off guard. "She would never have forced me to marry a man, I fear," she said before she could stop herself. Her father flinched as if struck. "You don't understand the position we're in. Blackwood holds everything. The mortgage, my debts, my freedom." "So, you traded mine instead?" Thomas looked up at her then, his bloodshot eyes filled with a mixture of shame and defiance. "What choice did I have? We were drowning." "There's always a choice," Eleanor said softly. The words meant as much for herself. As for him, she went inside, leaving her father to his regrets and justifications. In her room, she stood at the window, staring out at the juniper grove barely visible in the gathering darkness. Beyond it lay uncertainty, danger, and the possibility of freedom. Behind her lay the suffocating security of a life mapped out by men who saw her as property. Eleanor touched the silver bracelet at her wrist, remembering the Navajo woman's words. "For spirit, strong spirit, like a mountain." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Eleanor Mason began to pack. Saturday morning dawned with an oppressive stillness that seemed to hold Copper Springs in suspended animation. Eleanor moved through, her routine with deliberate calm. Each mundane task weighted with significance as potentially the last time she would perform it. She swept the store floor methodically, arranged new bolts of fabric with care, and recorded inventory figures in the ledger with perfect penmanship. Every customer who entered received her most gracious smile, even Mrs. Peterson, with her probing questions about the wedding night. Eleanor played her role flawlessly, the dutiful daughter, the grateful bride-to-be, while beneath the surface her mind calculated and planned. The secret cache of belongings she'd prepared the night before remained hidden beneath her bed at home. A change of clothes, her mother's Bible with pressed wildflowers between its pages, the money from Ezra, basic medical supplies, and a small knife her father had given her on her 16th birthday. Everything essential, nothing that would slow her down. Just before noon, the bell above the door chimed as Martha Collins entered, carrying a covered basket. "I brought you lunch," she announced, setting the basket on the counter. "Thought you might be too busy to step away today." Eleanor's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "That's very kind of you." Martha glanced around to ensure they were alone, then lowered her voice. "There's something else in there too. At the bottom." Curious, Eleanor lifted the checkered cloth covering the food to reveal a small leather pouch nestled beneath bread and cheese. "It's not much," Martha explained, "but it was my grandmother's, a silver pendant. It might fetch a decent price if you ever find yourself in need." Eleanor looked up sharply. "Martha, Don't say anything," Martha cut her off gently. "Just know that not everyone in this town is blind to what's happening. Some of us remember what became of Blackwood's first wife." Before Eleanor could respond, the door opened again and several customers entered. Martha squeezed her hand once, then slipped away, leaving Eleanor stunned by the unexpected alliance. The afternoon brought one final test of Eleanor's resolve. Sheriff Blackwood strode into the store an hour before closing, resplendent in a new suit clearly purchased for tomorrow's wedding. "There's my bride," he announced loudly enough for the other customers to hear. "All ready for tomorrow, I trust?" Eleanor forced a smile. "Nearly. Just a few details to finish at the store." "Good, good." Blackwood's gaze swept over her possessively. "I've come to escort you to the final fitting for your dress. Mrs. Holloway is waiting." It was not a request. Eleanor untied her apron and reached for her shawl, feeling the weight of Blackwood's expectations with every movement. "I can close up later," she said, a thin attempt at delay. "Nonsense. Jenkins can mind it." Blackwood gestured to his deputy, who had entered silently behind him. "Can't you, Jenkins?" The deputy nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the assignment, but unwilling to contradict his boss. "Yes, sir. Happy to help, Miss Mason." Eleanor had no choice but to accompany Blackwood, her hand placed forcibly in the crook of his arm as they walked down Main Street. Townspeople nodded respectfully, offering congratulations on the upcoming nuptials while carefully avoiding her eyes. At Mrs. Holloway's shop, the completed wedding dress hung like a ghost in the fitting room, its ivory satin catching the afternoon light. Eleanor stared at it, this beautiful cage crafted specifically for her. "I'll wait outside," Blackwood said, his tone making it clear he expected no objections. "Don't dawdle." Mrs. Holloway helped Eleanor into the dress, her fingers efficient as they fastened the long row of pearl buttons. "It fits perfectly," she declared, standing back to admire her work. "Sheriff Blackwood will be pleased." Eleanor gazed at her reflection. In the full-length mirror, the dress was objectively stunning, transforming her into a vision of bridal perfection. It was also everything she had never wanted: ornate, restrictive, chosen by a man who saw her as an acquisition rather than a pursuit. "Could I have a moment alone?" she asked quietly. "To reflect." Mrs. Holloway hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, dear. Take your time. It's an emotional moment for any bride." When the door closed behind the dressmaker, Eleanor sagged against the wall, fingers clutching the satin bodice that suddenly felt like it was suffocating her. This was the reality of the path laid before her, a life of performing to Blackwood's expectations, of being displayed and admired as his possession. Through the thin wall, she could hear Blackwood's voice as he spoke to Mrs. Holloway. The house is ready. Had the special furniture delivered from Phoenix yesterday. A proper marriage bed for a proper wife?" Mrs. Holloway's response was inaudible, but Blackwood's chuckle carried clearly. "She'll learn to appreciate it all in time. Women need a firm hand to show them their place." Eleanor closed her eyes, the decision she had been wrestling with suddenly crystallizing into absolute certainty. She will not be here tomorrow. She would not wear this dress before the town. She would not become Mrs. Walter Blackwood. She changed back into her own clothes with trembling fingers, careful not to damage the dress that would hang expectantly in Mrs. Holloway's shop long after she was gone. When she emerged, her face was composed, her manner subdued in a way Blackwood clearly mistook for proper bridal nerves. "Beautiful," he proclaimed, though she was now in her simple work dress. "Tomorrow you'll be the envy of every woman in the territory." "It's a lovely dress," Eleanor agreed, the only truth she could offer. Blackwood escorted her back to the store, where Deputy Jenkins had managed to misplace several items and confuse a customer's order. Eleanor corrected the mistakes efficiently, her mind now focused on the hours ahead. "I'll see you at the house this evening," Blackwood informed her as he prepared to leave. "Your father and I have final arrangements to discuss." Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The weight of the ruby ring on her finger felt suddenly unbearable. After Blackwood and his deputy departed, Eleanor waited precisely 15 minutes before closing the store. Instead of heading directly home, she made a detour to the general supply shop several doors down. "Afternoon, Miss Mason," Mr. Phillips greeted her. "What can I help you with today?" "I need a length of white cotton," Eleanor said steadily, "for a household project. If Mr. Phillips found the request unusual, he didn't show it. He cut a yard of plain white fabric, wrapped it in paper, and accepted her coins without comment. Eleanor's final stop was at the telegraph office, where she sent a brief message to her mother's cousin in California, a woman she had never met, but whose address she had memorized from her mother's letters. It was a precaution, a distant lifeline, if her plans with Key Benally fell through. Eleanor had no idea if the woman would welcome her, but it was one more option than she'd had yesterday. The walk home felt different, charged with purpose and finality. Eleanor absorbed the familiar sights of Copper Springs as if seeing them. For the first time, the wooden boardwalks worn smooth by years of boots, the hitching posts outside the saloon, the church steeple rising above the town like an accusing finger pointing to heaven. For 23 years, this had been her entire world. By tomorrow, it would be her past. At home, she found her father and Sheriff Blackwood in deep discussion over glasses of whiskey. They fell silent when she entered, exchanging glances that immediately raised her suspicions. "There she is," Thomas Mason said with forced cheer. "We were just discussing the final details for tomorrow." "Everything's arranged," Blackwood added, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Reverend Phillips is prepared. The reception will be at the hotel, and our new home awaits." Eleanor nodded, hanging her shawl on the hook by the door. "It sounds perfect." The lie came easier now, part of her evolving strategy for survival. Blackwood rose, stepping close enough that Eleanor could smell the whiskey on his breath. "I've also arranged a special surprise for my bride." She steeled herself against his proximity. "Oh? I've decided we'll live here, on the Mason Ranch," he announced, watching her face carefully. "I've purchased the property from your father, debt forgiven, fresh start for everyone." The revelation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Not only was Blackwood claiming her, but he was also taking her home, the last connection to her mother, the place of both her happiest and most painful memories. "That's quite a surprise," she managed. Thomas couldn't meet her eyes. "It's for the best, Eleanor. I can't manage the place anymore. Walter will restore it to what it once was." "And where will you go?" she asked her father, genuine concern. "Breaking through her facade. I've taken a position managing the hotel bar in town," Thomas replied. "Walter arranged it, room and board included." Of course he had. Another chain of obligation binding her father to Blackwood's influence. "You're too kind," Eleanor said to Blackwood, the words ashen in her mouth. "Nothing's too good for my family," he replied, his hand closing possessively over hers, thumb brushing across the ruby ring. "I take care of what's mine." The evening dragged interminably. Eleanor prepared dinner, served the men, and participated minimally in conversation while her mind raced ahead to midnight. With each passing hour, Blackwood grew more expansive, detailing his plans for the ranch, for their life together, for the children she would bear him. "At least 3 sons," he declared, eyeing her figure with unconcealed assessment. "You've got good childbearing hips. My first wife was too frail." For it, Eleanor concentrated on her breathing, on maintaining the mask of demure acceptance, while inwardly recoiling from each word. Her father, deep in his cups, nodded agreeably to everything Blackwood said, occasionally offering slurred congratulations on his daughter's good fortune. When Blackwood finally rose to leave, the grandfather clock in the hallway showed 9:15. Less than 3 hours until she needed to be ready. "I'll see you at the church, my dear," Blackwood said, his hand lingering on her shoulder. "Sleep well. Tomorrow begins our new life." Eleanor forced herself to smile. "I'll be there." After seeing Blackwood out, she returned to find her father staring morosely into his empty glass. "He's a good man, Eleanor," Thomas slurred. "Better than you think. Better than me, that's certain." Eleanor began clearing the dishes, not trusting herself to respond. "I know you blame me," her father continued, "for your mother, for the debts, for this marriage. But you'll see. It'll turn out right in the end." She paused, dirty plates balanced in her hands, and looked at the broken man who had once been her hero. Despite everything, a part of her ached for him still. "I hope you find peace, Father," she said quietly. "Truly." Thomas blinked at her in confusion, perhaps sensing something final in her tone, but too dulled by alcohol to identify it. "Help me to bed, will you?" he asked, attempting to stand and swaying dangerously. Eleanor set down the dishes and supported her father up the stairs to his room, a familiar routine from countless nights over the years. She removed his boots, helped him lie down, and covered him with a blanket. For a long moment she stood in the doorway watching him. This might be the last time she ever saw him. Despite his failings, despite the unconscionable bargain he had made with her future, he was still her father. The thought of never seeing him again opened a hollow place inside her. "Good night," she whispered, though he was already snoring softly. In her own room, Eleanor moved with quiet efficiency. She changed into her sturdiest dress, wrapped a warm shawl around her shoulders, and retrieved her hidden bundle of belongings. The silver bracelet from the Navajo woman glinted on her wrist, a talisman of courage. Just before 11, she crept downstairs and out to the barn, where she saddled Penny, the aging mare who had been her companion since childhood. The horse sensed her tension, ears flicking nervously as Eleanor secured her small bundle to the saddle. "Easy, girl," she murmured, stroking the mare's velvety nose. "We have a long journey ahead." With the horse prepared, Eleanor had one final task before departure. Taking the white cotton fabric she had purchased that afternoon, she slipped through the shadows to the edge of the property where the juniper tree stood sentinel. The night was clear, a half-moon providing just enough light to navigate by. Eleanor tied the white cloth securely to a low branch, the signal to Key that she had made her decision. The fabric gleamed silver in the moonlight, a flag of surrender and defiance all at once. As she turned to go, movement caught her eye. A figure detached itself from the deeper shadows of the grove. Key Bennerly stepped forward, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You came early," Eleanor said, surprised. "Better to wait here than risk being seen approaching later," he replied. "Practically. You've decided then." It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. "Yes." Key's gaze moved past her to the house, dark except for the lamp she had left burning in the kitchen. "Your father?" "Asleep. He won't wake until morning. And Blackwood? Gone back to town." Eleanor hesitated. "He's bought the ranch. Plans for us to live here after tomorrow." Something flickered across Key's stoic features. "Then it's good you're leaving tonight," he whistled softly, and a second horse emerged from the trees, a sturdy black gelding with a white blaze on its forehead. Unlike Eleanor's mare, this horse moved with the quiet confidence of an animal trained for stealth. "Are you ready?" Key asked, studying her face carefully. Eleanor took one last look at the house where she had spent her entire life. In her mind's eye, she saw it as it had once been. Her mother tending flowers in the garden, her father repairing fence posts with strong, steady hands, herself as a child running carefree through rooms filled with laughter and security. That home was gone. What remained was just a structure soon to be claimed by Walter Blackwood like everything else. "I'm ready," she said, turning back to Key with newfound resolve. He nodded once, then pointed to the north. "We ride that way through the wash to avoid leaving tracks. We need to put at least 15 miles between us and Copper Springs before dawn." Eleanor moved toward the barn where Penny waited, but Key's voice stopped her. "One more thing," he said, his tone serious. "The ring." Eleanor looked down at her left hand, where the ruby still glinted darkly. She had almost forgotten it in the rush of preparation. "Leave it," Key advised. "It marks you as his." With a sudden decision, Eleanor twisted the ring from her finger. She considered throwing it away, this symbol of ownership and control. But practicality prevailed. Instead, she placed it carefully on a rock beside the juniper tree. "Let him find it here," she said, straightening. "Let him know I chose to leave it behind." A ghost of a smile crossed Key's face, the first Eleanor had seen from him. "You have more warrior spirit than you know," he said quietly. Together they retrieved Penny from the barn. The old mare eyed Key's gelding warily, but didn't protest. When he took her reins, to lead them both toward the wash that cut through the eastern edge of the property. The first quarter-mile was the most dangerous, open ground between the barn and the relative safety of the wash. Eleanor's heart pounded with each step, expecting at any moment to hear her father calling, or worse, to see Blackwood's men emerging from the shadows. But the night remained still, except for the soft padding of the horses' hooves on sandy soil. When they reached the wash, Eleanor felt the first real stirring of hope. They were actually doing this. She was escaping. Key helped her mount, his hands strong and impersonal, as he boosted her into the saddle. Then he swung easily onto his own horse, a fluid movement that spoke of a lifetime on horseback. "Stay close," he instructed. "Follow my lead. If something happens, ride north toward the Red Mesa. I'll find you." Eleanor nodded, suddenly unable to speak past the lump in her throat. This was real. She was leaving everything she had ever known to follow a near stranger into wilderness and uncertainty. As if sensing her wavering courage, Key turned in his saddle to face her. In the moonlight, his features were solemn yet somehow reassuring. "The first step is the hardest," he said simply. "Each one after becomes easier." With that, he urged his horse forward into the wash, and Eleanor followed, leaving behind the life that had been planned for her and riding toward one she would create for herself. Behind them, the ruby ring gleamed like a drop of blood in the moonlight, the only evidence of Eleanor Mason's final choice. The night embraced them as they rode northward, the wash gradually deepening into a narrow canyon that guided them through the rocky landscape. Eleanor's muscles ached from the unfamiliar hours in the saddle, but she pressed on without complaint, watching Key's straight-backed silhouette ahead of her. They traveled in near-total silence, the only sounds the rhythmic breathing of the horses, and the occasional shifting of rocks beneath hooves. Eleanor's mind raced between exhilaration and terror. What she had done would be discovered in mere hours. By this time tomorrow, she would be branded an ungrateful daughter, a runaway bride, perhaps even a thief for taking Penny. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when Key signaled a halt. They had reached a secluded box canyon, its entrance nearly invisible unless approached from the correct angle. "We'll rest here today," he said, dismounting smoothly. "The horses need water, and we need to sleep." Eleanor slid awkwardly from her saddle, her legs nearly buckling when they hit the ground. She stumbled, catching herself against Penny's flank. "First day is always the hardest," Key observed, already unsaddling his gelding. "It gets easier." A small spring trickled from the canyon wall, forming a shallow pool before disappearing again into the earth. Key led both horses to drink, while Eleanor surveyed their temporary sanctuary. The canyon walls rose steep and protective on three sides, providing shade and concealment. From here, they would see anyone approaching before being seen themselves. "How far have we come?" Eleanor asked, her voice sounding strange after hours of silence. "About 17 miles, Key replied. "Good distance. Blackwood will expect you to head for the railroad at Benson or the stage road to Tucson. Few would think to go north into the mountains." Eleanor unslung her bundle from Penny's saddle, wincing at the stiffness in her shoulders. "When will they discover I'm gone?" "Morning. Your father first, then Blackwood when you don't appear at the church." Key began gathering dry brush for a small, smokeless fire. "By noon he'll have men searching." The matter-of-fact assessment sent a chill through Eleanor. "What if they find us?" Key's expression hardened. "They won't, not if we're careful." He indicated the narrow entrance to the canyon. "One way in, easy to defend, but we won't stay long enough to need to." Eleanor watched as he expertly constructed a tiny fire pit, positioning stones to reflect. "Heat while containing the flames. You've done this before," she observed. "Helped people escape." 3 others, he confirmed without elaboration. "Get some sleep. I'll take my first watch." Exhaustion suddenly crashed over Eleanor like a wave. She spread her blanket in a sheltered alcove of rock and lay down, certain her racing mind would prevent sleep despite her body's fatigue. Instead, she was unconscious within minutes. She woke to Key's hand on her shoulder, gentle but insistent. The sun had moved significantly, now high overhead. She had slept for hours. "Someone's coming," he said quietly, already moving toward the canyon. Entrance with his rifle. Fully alert in an instant, Eleanor scrambled to her feet. Blackwood? Not yet. A single rider, moving carefully. Could be a scout. Heart-pounding, Eleanor followed Key to where he crouched behind a boulder, the rifle resting easily in his hands. The horses had been moved deeper into the canyon, out of sight from the entrance. "What do we do?" she whispered. "Wait. Watch." His voice was calm, his body still. Only his eyes moved, tracking something beyond her vision. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then Eleanor heard it, the soft crunching of hooves on gravel, moving slowly closer. Key raised the rifle to his shoulder, sighting down the barrel with practiced ease. The rider appeared at the mouth of the canyon, a lone figure on a dappled mare. Eleanor gasped in recognition. "Ezra!" Key's finger remained on the trigger, his aim unwavering. "You know him?" "He's a friend," Eleanor said quickly. "The blacksmith I told you about. He helped me, gave me money." Key didn't lower the rifle. He could have been followed. "Ezra!" Eleanor called, ignoring Key's warning glare. "We're here!" The blacksmith reined in his horse, shading his eyes against the sun. When he spotted Eleanor, relief washed over his face. "Thank God," he breathed, dismounting quickly. "I was afraid I'd missed you." Key finally lowered his rifle, though his posture remained wary. "How did you find us?" Ezra approached cautiously, hands visible. "I knew Eleanor would head north, away from the obvious routes. The wash was the only way to leave without tracks. I followed it until I found signs of 2 horses. "Why?" Key demanded. Still suspicious, Ezra turned to Eleanor. "Blackwood knows you're gone. He came to the church early, some premonition, I guess. When you weren't at the ranch, he went straight to the store, found it locked, no sign of you." Eleanor's stomach clenched. "My father, still sleeping when Blackwood got there. The sheriff woke him, nearly beating him trying to get information." Ezra's face darkened. "Your father couldn't tell them anything. He didn't know." Guilt twisted in Eleanor's chest. She hadn't intended for her father to suffer for her escape. "Blackwood's gathered a posse," Ezra continued. 10 men, including that bastard McGrath who tracks for the army. They're heading south toward Tucson, but McGrath will figure out the truth soon enough." Key exchanged a sharp glance with Eleanor. "We need to move." "Wait," Ezra said urgently. "That's why I came. To warn you, yes, but also to tell you about the old mining road." He turned to Key. "There's a trail through the mountains, used by silver miners years back. It's overgrown now, hard to spot unless you know where to look. Follows a creek bed part of the way. McGrath doesn't know it." "I know the trail," Key said, his assessment of Ezra shifting visibly. "It passes near Navajo lands." "Exactly. It could give you a day's head start, at least." Eleanor stepped forward, grasping Ezra's roughened hands in hers. "Thank you, but you're risking everything coming here. If Blackwood suspects you helped me, let him suspect," Ezra said fiercely. "I told Martha Collins I was heading to Tucson for supplies. I'll be back in town before anyone questions it." Eleanor embraced him impulsively. "I can never repay you." "Who for this?" Ezra hugged her briefly, then stepped back. "Just be happy, Eleanor. That's enough repayment." He had already begun saddling the horses, his movements efficient and urgent. "We need to go. Now." Ezra nodded. "I'll ride south for a few miles, leaving some false tracks. Might buy you more time." "The creek trail joins the old Spanish road after 20 miles, Key said. "We can make that by nightfall if we push." Ezra mounted his horse, then paused. Reaching into his saddlebag, he withdrew a small revolver, offering it to Eleanor. "Take this. 6 shots, already loaded. May you never need it." Eleanor accepted the weapon, its weight unfamiliar and sobering in her palm. "Be careful, Ezra. You too." With a final nod to Key, Ezra turned his horse and rode out, the sound of hoofbeats fading quickly in the vast desert silence. They were on the trail within minutes, Key leading them deeper into the craggy foothills. The terrain grew increasingly challenging, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses through narrow passages where sheer rock walls rose on either side. "Will Ezra be safe?" Eleanor asked as they navigated a particularly treacherous section. "If he's smart, yes," Key replied. "Blackwood is focused on finding you, not who helped you." The unspoken implication hung between them. Blackwood's rage would be terrible when he caught them, not if, when. Despite Ezra's warning and their head start, the fear of pursuit clung to Eleanor like a shadow. As the day progressed, the landscape transformed around them. They climbed steadily upward, leaving the desert floor behind for pinyon juniper woodlands, where the air grew cooler and carried the scent of pine. In another context, Eleanor might have found beauty in the dramatic terrain. Now each rocky outcrop and dense stand of trees represented potential danger or shelter. "There," Key said late in the afternoon, pointing to a nearly invisible gap between two boulders, "the mining trail." The path was little more than a game trail now, reclaimed by nature in the decades since silver miners had abandoned their claims. But Key navigated it confidently, identifying old blazes on trees and rockfalls that might have deterred less experienced travelers. They reached the promised creek as sunset painted the western sky in brilliant orange and crimson. The water ran clear and cold, tumbling over moss-covered stones. Both horses drank eagerly, while Eleanor and Key refilled their canteens. "We'll follow the creek for 3 miles, Key explained, studying the darkening sky. "Then camp for a few hours. We need to reach the Spanish Road before dawn." Eleanor nodded, too exhausted to speak. Every muscle in her body protested the day's exertion, unused to such demands. But she didn't complain. Each mile increased the distance between herself and Copper Springs, between the life chosen for her and the one she was choosing now. The small fire that night was a concession to necessity. The mountain air had grown bitterly cold, and Eleanor huddled close to the flames, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "Here," Key said, offering her a strip of dried meat and a handful of pinyon nuts. "Not much, but it will keep your strength up." Eleanor accepted the simple meal gratefully. They ate in silence for a time, the crackling fire and distant call of an owl the only sounds. "Tell me about the place we're going to," she said finally. "You mentioned others who've left their old lives behind." Key poked at the fire with a stick, his expression thoughtful. "It's a settlement in a hidden valley, 3 days' journey from here. Some call it Perdido Canyon." "Lost Canyon," Eleanor translated. "Appropriate. The people there don't ask questions about the past. Some are running from the law, others from situations like yours. They judge by what you contribute, not where you came from. And they accept you?" "A Navajo?" A hint of amusement crossed Key's face. "They tolerate me. I bring supplies, news, and occasionally new residents. I won't stay." Eleanor considered this. "Where do you go when you're not guiding people to safety?" Key was silent for a long moment. "I move between worlds, not fully part of either anymore." The admission carried a weight of loneliness that resonated with something in Eleanor. Despite being surrounded by people in Copper Springs, she had often felt just as isolated, trapped between the expectations of others and her own quiet desires. "What will I do there?" she asked. "In Perdido Canyon?" "Whatever you choose. There's a woman, Rebecca, who runs a kind of school for the children. She was a teacher back east before she killed her husband for beating her once too often." Eleanor's eyes widened at the matter-of-fact revelation. "There's a need for someone with Knowledge of medicine, Key continued. Your skills with herbs would be valued. The thought was surprisingly appealing, using her knowledge to heal rather than selling goods she cared nothing about. A life of her own choosing, where her value wasn't determined by marriage prospects or a father's debts. Sleep, Key advised, interrupting her thoughts. I'll wake you before dawn. Eleanor curled up in her blanket, the revolver Ezra had given her within easy reach. Despite the hard ground and uncertain future, sleep came more easily than it had in weeks. The distant crack of a rifle shot shattered the pre-dawn stillness. Eleanor bolted upright, heart pounding, to find Key already on his feet, rifle in hand. The fire had been extinguished hours ago, leaving only cold ashes. What was that? She whispered. Trouble, Key replied grimly. Someone's on the trail behind us. Another shot rang out, closer this time, followed by the faint sound of voices carried on the wind. Blackwood? Eleanor's mouth went dry with fear. Likely, or McGrath and his men. They found our trail faster than I expected. Key was already saddling the horses with swift efficiency. We need to move, now. Eleanor grabbed her few belongings, shoving them into her saddlebag with trembling hands. The revolver went into the pocket of her dress, its weight both reassuring and terrifying. They mounted quickly, abandoning any attempt at covering their tracks in favor of speed. Key led them deeper into the creek bed, where the flowing water would at least partially obscure their passage. The Spanish road is less than 2 miles ahead, he said over his shoulder. If we can reach it before they catch up, we have a chance. Eleanor urged Penny to greater speed, the aging mare struggling to keep pace with Key's gelding. The creek bed narrowed, forcing them to ride single file through a passage where the water ran swift and deep. Suddenly, Penny stumbled, her front hoof catching between 2 submerged rocks. The mare whinnied in pain, nearly throwing Eleanor from the saddle. She's hurt, Eleanor cried, dismounting quickly to examine the horse's leg. Key circled back, his expression tense. How bad? Eleanor ran her hands over Penny's foreleg, feeling the heat of inflammation already building. She won't be able to run, maybe not even walk far. Another rifle shot echoed through the canyon, close enough to send birds scattering from nearby trees. Leave her, Key said, his voice hard with urgency. Ride double with me. Eleanor looked at Penny, this faithful companion who had been part of her life since childhood. The thought of abandoning her to Blackwood's men was unbearable. No, she said firmly, they'll mistreat her to punish me. Before Key could protest, Eleanor removed her saddlebag and the small bundle of her possessions. She slapped Penny's flank sharply, sending the mare hobbling downstream, away from the direction of pursuit. She'll find grazing, Eleanor said, blinking back unexpected tears. She deserves her freedom too. Key extended his hand without comment, pulling Eleanor up behind him on the gelding. She settled awkwardly, arms circling his waist for balance, as the horse lurched into motion. They hadn't gone more than a half-mile when 3 riders appeared on the ridge above them, silhouetted against the lightening sky. There! A voice shouted. I see them! Rifles cracked again, bullets spraying water inches from the gelding's hooves. The horse reared in panic, nearly unseating both riders. Hold on! Key commanded, urging the frightened animal forward into a gallop. Eleanor clung desperately to Key's waist as they thundered through the creek bed, water splashing up around them. A bullet whizzed past her ear, close enough that she felt its passage like a whisper of death. Ahead, the creek curved sharply around a massive boulder. He guided the gelding out of the water and into a dense thicket of pine and juniper that offered momentary cover. Dismount, he ordered, sliding off the horse and pulling Eleanor with him. We can't outrun them on one horse. What do we do? Eleanor gasped, adrenaline coursing through her veins. Key unslung his rifle, checking the chamber. I'll draw them off. You take the horse and continue to the Spanish road. No, Eleanor protested. They'll kill you. They'll kill us both if we stay together, Key countered. This is our only chance. The sound of pursuing horses grew louder, accompanied by shouts as Blackwood's men coordinated their approach. I won't leave you, Eleanor insisted. Key gripped her shoulders, his dark eyes intense. This isn't about nobility, Eleanor. It's about survival. Someone needs to slow them down, or neither of us will escape. Then I'll do it, she said, drawing Ezra's revolver from her pocket. They won't shoot a woman. Blackwood might. Key's expression softened slightly. You've shown more courage than most men I've known. Now show wisdom too. A shout from nearby indicated their pursuers were closing in. There was no more time for debate. Head north, Key instructed, helping Eleanor back onto the gelding. The Spanish road is marked by 3 tall pines growing in a triangle. Follow. Hit east until you reach a stone ruin. Old mission. Wait for me there, and if you don't come. The question trembled between them. Then continue east to Perdido Canyon. Ask for Rebecca. Tell her I sent you. Eleanor clutched the reins, torn between self-preservation and loyalty to the man who had risked everything to help her escape. Go! Key urged, slapping the gelding's flank. Now! The horse sprang forward, carrying Eleanor deeper into the trees. Behind her, she heard Key moving in the opposite direction, deliberately making noise to attract attention. Gunfire erupted moments later, the rapid exchange of shots echoing through the canyon. Eleanor fought the impulse to turn back, forcing herself to focus on the path ahead. Key had given her a chance. She couldn't waste it. The gelding picked its way through the undergrowth, seemingly understanding the need for stealth. Eleanor bent low over its neck, murmuring encouragement as they navigated the treacherous terrain. More shots rang out, followed by shouting. Then, most terrifying of all, silence. Eleanor's imagination filled the void with horrific possibilities. Had Key been captured, wounded, killed? The questions tormented her as she rode on, searching desperately for the 3 pines that would mark the Spanish road. The sun had fully risen when she finally spotted them, 3 towering ponderosas growing in a perfect triangle, just as Key had described. Beyond them stretched a faint track worn into the earth by centuries of travelers. Eleanor paused at this crossroads, torn between continuing to safety and returning to learn Key's fate. In the distance, she could see the sprawling expanse of desert giving way to mountains, freedom and uncertainty beckoning. Behind her lay danger, but also the man who had risked everything to offer her this chance. With sudden resolve, Eleanor turned the gelding away from the Spanish road, back toward the sound of gunfire that had now resumed in the distance. She had not escaped one cage, only to abandon the one person who had helped her find freedom. Eleanor guided the gelding through the pine forest with newfound determination, moving as quietly as possible while retracing their path. The sporadic gunfire had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against her ears like a physical force. She dismounted at a small clearing, tethering the horse to a juniper tree before continuing on foot. The rough terrain forced her to move slowly, each step calculated to avoid loose stones or cracking branches. Her heart hammered against her ribs. As she crept forward, Ezra's revolver clutched in her trembling hand. Through a break in the trees, Eleanor caught her first glimpse of the confrontation site. 3 horses stood nearby, reins trailing, while their riders crouched behind boulders. One man lay motionless on the ground, blood darkening the earth beneath him. Of Key, there was no sign. Sheriff Blackwood's voice carried clearly across the small ravine. "You're outgunned, Indian. Throw down your weapon and we'll let you live." From somewhere to Eleanor's left came Key's response, strained but defiant. "Like you let those families live at Silver Creek." "That was different," Blackwood called back. "That was justice." "No," Key replied. "That was murder for profit." A rifle cracked in response, the bullet splintering bark from a tree near where Key's voice had originated. Eleanor inched closer, using the dense underbrush as cover. She could now see the full tableau. Blackwood and 2 deputies positioned in a rough semicircle, pinning Key down behind a fallen log. A dark stain on Key's sleeve indicated he'd been wounded. "McGrath!" Blackwood shouted to one of his men. "Circle!" Around behind him. "Jenkins, keep him pinned down." The tracker named McGrath began moving stealthily to the right, seeking to flank Key's position. Eleanor realized with horror that Key was moments from being caught in a deadly crossfire. Without conscious thought, she raised Ezra's revolver and fired. The shot went wide, but it achieved her purpose. McGrath dove for cover, temporarily abandoning his flanking maneuver. "What the hell?" Blackwood spun toward the source of the new threat. "Who's there?" Eleanor fired again, this time aiming directly at the rock where Blackwood sheltered. The bullet struck stone inches from the sheriff's head, sending fragments flying. In the confusion, Key seized the opportunity. He fired twice in rapid succession, forcing Jenkins to retreat behind a boulder. Then, in a burst of movement, Key darted from his position to a new vantage point closer to where Eleanor hid. There, eyes met briefly across the distance, his wide with surprise, hers steady with resolve. "Eleanor!" Blackwood's voice boomed through the forest, rage giving it a dangerous edge. "I know you're out there, girl. This ends now." "It ended when you tried to buy me," Eleanor called back, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. She fired again, forcing McGrath to abandon his attempt to circle around. The tracker cursed, diving behind a tree trunk as the bullet thudded into wood. "3 shots," Key murmured suddenly beside her. "3 left." Eleanor startled at his proximity. He had moved like a shadow across the forest floor to reach her. "Position. You're bleeding," she whispered, noticing the crimson stain spreading across his sleeve. "Just a graze. Why did you come back?" Before she could answer, a volley of gunfire erupted from Blackwood's position, forcing them both lower to the ground. "You're making a mistake, Eleanor," Blackwood shouted when the firing ceased. "That savage won't protect you. Come back now, and I'll forgive this foolishness." Eleanor felt a surge of clarity, as if the past 2 days had stripped away years of uncertainty and fear. "There's nothing to forgive, Walter," she called. "I made my choice." Key touched her arm lightly. "We need to move. They're trying to pin us down until more men arrive." "What's the plan?" Eleanor asked, gripping the revolver with renewed determination. "There's a ravine 50 yards east. If we can reach it, we might be able to double back to the horse and escape." Key checked his rifle. Only 2 rounds remained. "I'll draw their fire. When I do, run for that lightning-struck pine. Wait for my signal, then make for the ravine." Eleanor nodded, steeling herself. "Be careful." A ghost of a smile crossed Key's face. "You're the one who came back for me, remember?" With that, he darted into the open, firing once to draw attention. Immediately, Blackwood and his men returned. Fire, concentrating on Key's new position, Eleanor seized the moment, sprinting for the designated pine tree. She was halfway there when McGrath spotted her movement. "The girl! 9 o'clock!" he shouted. A bullet whined past her ear as Eleanor threw herself behind the pine, breathing hard. From his position, Key provided covering fire with his final round, forcing McGrath back into cover. "Now!" Key called to her. "The ravine! Go!" Eleanor launched herself forward again, running in a zigzag pattern as Key had taught her. The ravine appeared ahead, a jagged cut in the earth that would provide both cover and a path to escape. Behind her she heard a commotion, shouts, a brief struggle, then Blackwood's triumphant voice. "Got you now, you red-skin bastard!" Eleanor faltered, glancing back to see Key on his knees, McGrath's rifle pressed to his head while Blackwood approached, revolver drawn. Time seemed to slow as Eleanor faced the ravine ahead. Safety, escape, the future she had risked everything to claim, and Key behind her captured because he had created a diversion for her escape. The choice crystallized in that moment. Eleanor raised Ezra's revolver, steadied her breath as her father had once taught her long ago, and fired. The bullet struck McGrath's shoulder with devastating accuracy. The tracker screamed, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the air as he stumbled backward. Key reacted instantly, driving his elbow into McGrath's gut and wrenching away from his grasp. Blackwood turned in shock, his revolver swinging toward Eleanor. She fired again, her fifth shot, the bullet grazing Blackwood's temple. The sheriff dropped to one knee, blood streaming down his face. "Run!" Eleanor screamed to Key, who was already sprinting toward her position. Jenkins, the remaining deputy, emerged from cover with his rifle raised. Eleanor fired her final shot, missing him, but causing him to dive for safety. It was enough. Key reached her side, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the ravine. They half ran, half slid down the steep embankment, loose stones cascading around them. Behind them, Blackwood's enraged shouts faded as distance and terrain muffled the sound. "The horse!" Eleanor gasped as they reached the bottom. "This way," Key directed, leading her along the ravine floor. "There's another path up." They moved swiftly, following the natural contours of the land. The ravine eventually widened, its walls less steep, allowing them to scramble up to level ground again. By some miracle, they emerged less than 100 yards from where Eleanor had tethered the gelding. The horse nickered softly as they approached. Key quickly checked the saddle and bridle, then mounted, pulling Eleanor up behind him. "Hold tight," he instructed, urging the gelding into a canter. Eleanor wrapped her arms around his waist, her body pressed against his back as they rode. The terrain blurred around them. Pine forest giving way to scrubland, then back to forest. As they climbed higher into the mountains, it was nearly sunset when Key finally reined in the tired horse. They had reached a rocky outcrop that provided a panoramic view of the land they had traversed. Far below, the sprawling expanse of desert stretched away toward Copper Springs, now invisible in the distance. "We should be safe for now," Key said, dismounting stiffly. His wounded arm had stiffened during the ride, the blood stain now dry and dark against his sleeve. Eleanor slid from the horse, her legs trembling with exhaustion and fading adrenaline. "Let me see your wound," Key allowed her to examine his arm. The bullet had carved a furrow across his bicep, painful but not serious. Eleanor tore a strip from her petticoat, using water from their canteen to clean the injury before binding it tightly. "You shot well back there," Key observed as she worked. "Where did you learn?" "My father, before the drinking took hold," Eleanor replied, tying off the bandage. "He taught me when I was 12, said every girl on the frontier should know how to defend herself." "He taught you well." Eleanor sat back on her heels, suddenly overcome by the events of the day. "I shot a man, 2 men. You saved my life," Key corrected quietly. "And your own." The simple truth of this statement settled over Eleanor like a mantle. She had indeed saved them both, not through chance or luck, but through deliberate action, and courage she hadn't known she possessed. "What happens now?" she asked, gazing out at the darkening landscape. Key followed her gaze. "Blackwood is wounded but alive. He won't give up easily. So we keep running. For now," Key agreed, "but not forever." They made a cold camp that night, unwilling to risk a fire that might attract attention. Huddled beneath a shared blanket, for warmth, Eleanor found herself studying Key's profile in the moonlight. The stern lines of his face had softened slightly, revealing the man beneath the warrior's mask. "Why did you come back for me?" he asked suddenly, breaking the long silence. Eleanor considered the question carefully. "Because you were willing to sacrifice yourself so I could escape, because no one has ever done that for me before." "It was tactical," Key said, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. "It was bravery," Eleanor countered, "and I couldn't leave behind the only person who's treated me like I have value beyond what men want from me." Key was silent for a long moment. "In my tribe, there's a saying, 'The eagle does not hunt flies.' It means a person of true worth doesn't concern themselves with petty things. What does that have to do with me? You could have continued to the Spanish Road. to safety, the easier path. Key turned to face her. Instead, you chose to return for someone others would consider beneath. Them, a Navajo, a stranger. You saw value beyond what your people typically recognize. Eleanor felt a flush of warmth at his words. You're not beneath anyone, Key Benali. The next morning brought clear skies and renewed determination. They set out at dawn, the gelding, moving more slowly under its double burden, but maintaining a steady pace. Key guided them higher into the mountains, following trails visible only to his experienced eye. By midday, they had reached a high plateau where ancient pines gave way to meadows carpeted with wildflowers. The air was cooler here, carrying the clean scent of pine and open spaces. The Spanish road lies just beyond that ridge, Key said, pointing to a distant line of trees. Another day's ride will bring us to the stone mission I mentioned. And after that? Eleanor asked. Perdido Canyon, safety. Key hesitated, then added, if that's still what you want. Eleanor considered this. 2 days ago, escape had been her only goal. Freedom from Blackwood and the life that had been forced upon her. Now, having tasted that freedom, having fought for it, she found her vision extending beyond mere escape to what might come after. I want to build something, she said slowly, articulating thoughts that had been forming since their flight began. Not just run from something. Key nodded, understanding in his eyes. That's the true test of freedom, what you choose to create with it. They rode in companionable silence until they reached the ridge overlooking the Spanish road. Below, the ancient track wound like a pale ribbon through valleys and around mountain flanks, a testament to centuries of human passage. Blackwood's jurisdiction ends at the territorial border, Key said. Once we cross into New Mexico, his legal authority vanishes. But not his hatred, Eleanor observed. He'll still hunt us. Perhaps, but with less support, fewer resources. Key dismounted, helping Eleanor down beside him, and will be more prepared. As they stood on the ridge, overlooking the path to their future, Eleanor felt a strange sense of completion. The woman who had left Copper Springs 2 nights ago, frightened, uncertain, defined by others, was gone. In her place stood someone new, forged in the crucible of fear, choice, and action. She reached up, unpinning her hair and letting it fall, loose around her shoulders. The wind caught it immediately, whipping it around her face like a living thing finally unleashed. Key watched this simple act of liberation with quiet appreciation. The Navajo believe that when a person faces death and survives, they are reborn. The old self dies, and a new one emerges. Is that what happened to us back there? Eleanor asked. I think it began happening to you the moment you decided to leave your old life behind, Key replied. The rest was just confirmation. They remounted and began the descent toward the Spanish road. As they rode, Eleanor found herself thinking, not of what she had left behind, her father, the store, the life mapped out for her, but of what lay ahead. Perdido Canyon with its community of outcasts and refugees, the possibility of using her knowledge of herbs and healing, the chance to define herself by her own choices rather than others' expectations, and perhaps most surprisingly, the man riding beside her, this warrior who had crossed boundaries of race and culture to offer her a way out, who had fought beside her and trusted her to fight for him. "Oh, what will you do?" she asked Key as they reached the ancient road. "After you deliver me to Perdido Canyon?" He considered the question, his eyes on the horizon. "For 2 years I've lived for one purpose, to find justice for my sister and her family. That path led me to watch Blackwood, which led me to you. And now I find myself considering new paths." His gaze met hers briefly. "Perhaps it's time I, too, build something rather than simply avenge what was destroyed." The Spanish road stretched before them, curving away toward distant mountains and valleys unseen. Eleanor touched the silver bracelet still circling her wrist, a talisman of her journey, a reminder of strength found when all seemed lost. "Then let's ride together," she said, her voice strong and clear in the mountain air, "and see where this path leads us both." Key nodded, a rare smile transforming his solemn features. Together they urged the gelding forward, leaving behind not just Copper Springs and Sheriff Blackwood, but the very people they had once been. Ahead lay Perdido Canyon, and beyond it, a future unmarked by others' designs, a future they would chart for themselves, step by step, choice by choice, day by day. As they rode, the setting sun cast their single shadow long upon the ancient road. Two figures merged into one, moving steadily toward the eastern horizon and whatever awaited them there. Eleanor. Mason, once nearly trapped in a cage of others' making, had found wings she never knew she possessed. And now, with the man who had helped her discover them, she soared toward a new dawn. Eleanor crept through the dense forest, Ezra's revolver clutched tightly in her trembling hand. The gunfire had stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence that pressed against her ears. She tethered Key's gelding to a juniper tree and continued forward on foot, careful to avoid loose stones and dry branches. Through a break in the trees, she finally glimpsed the confrontation site. 3 horses stood nearby, while their riders, who took cover behind boulders. One man lay motionless on the ground, his blood darkening the earth. Key was nowhere to be seen. Sheriff Blackwood's voice carried across the small ravine. "You're outgunned, Indian. Throw down your weapon and we'll let you live." "Like you let those families live at Silver Creek?" Key's strained but defiant voice came from somewhere to Eleanor's. "Left, that was different," Blackwood called back. "That was justice." "No," Key replied. "That was murder for profit." A rifle cracked in response, splintering bark near Key's position. Eleanor moved closer, using the underbrush as cover. She could now see the full scene. Blackwood and 2 deputies had Key pinned down behind a fallen log. The dark stain on his sleeve told her he was wounded. "McGrath!" Blackwood shouted. "Circle around behind him! Jenkins, keep him pinned down!" The tracker named McGrath began moving to flank Key. Eleanor realized with horror that Key was moments from being caught in a deadly crossfire. Without hesitation, she raised the revolver and fired. The shot went wide, but forced McGrath to dive for cover. "What the hell?" Blackwood spun toward her. "Who's there?" Eleanor fired again, the bullet striking inches from the sheriff's head, sending stone fragments flying. Key seized the opportunity. He fired twice, forcing Jenkins to retreat, then darted to a new position closer to Eleanor. Their eyes met briefly, his wide with surprise, hers steady with newfound resolve. "Eleanor!" Blackwood's voice boomed with rage. "I know you're out!" "You there, girl. This ends now." "It ended when you tried to buy me," Eleanor called back, surprising herself with her strength. 3 shots, Key whispered suddenly beside her. 3 left. "You're bleeding," she noticed. "Just a graze. Why did you come back?" Before she could answer, gunfire erupted from Blackwood's position, forcing them lower to the ground. "You're making a mistake, Eleanor," Blackwood shouted. "That? Savage won't protect you. Come back now, and I'll forgive this foolishness." Eleanor felt a surge of clarity. "There's nothing to forgive, Walter. I made my choice." Key touched her arm. "We need to move. They're trying to pin us down until more men arrive. What's the plan?" "There's a ravine 50 yards east. If we can reach it, we might double back to the horse and escape." Key checked his rifle. Only 2 rounds remained. "I'll draw their fire. When I do, run for that lightning-struck pine. Wait for my signal, then make for the ravine." Eleanor nodded. "Be careful." A ghost of a smile crossed Key's face. "You're the one who came back for me." He darted into the open, firing to draw attention. Blackwood and his men immediately returned fire. Eleanor seized the moment, sprinting for the pine tree. She was halfway there when McGrath spotted her. "The girl! 9 o'clock!" he shouted. A bullet whined past her ear as she threw herself behind the tree. Key provided covering fire with his final round. "Now!" he called. "The ravine! Go!" Eleanor ran in a zigzag pattern toward the jagged cut in the earth ahead. Behind her, she heard shouts, a brief struggle, then Blackwood's triumphant voice, "Got you now, you red-skinned bastard." She glanced back to see Key on his knees, McGrath's rifle pressed to his head, while Blackwood approached with a drawn revolver. Time slowed as Eleanor faced the choice between safety ahead and Key behind her. Captured because he had created a diversion for her escape, she raised Ezra's revolver, steadied her breath as her father had once taught her, and fired. The bullet struck McGrath's shoulder with devastating accuracy. The tracker screamed, his rifle discharging harmlessly as he stumbled backward. Key reacted instantly, driving his elbow into McGrath's gut and wrenching free. Blackwood turned toward Eleanor, his revolver swinging in her direction. She fired again, the bullet grazing his temple. The sheriff dropped to one knee, blood streaming down his face. "Run!" Eleanor screamed to Key, who was already sprinting toward her. Jenkins emerged with his rifle raised. Eleanor fired her final shot, missing him but causing him to dive for cover. It was enough. Key reached her side, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the ravine. They half ran, half slid down the steep embankment. Behind them, Blackwood's enraged shouts faded with distance. "The horse," Eleanor gasped. "This way," Key directed. "There's another path up." They moved swiftly along the ravine floor until it widened, allowing them to scramble back to level ground. By some miracle they emerged near where Eleanor had tethered the gelding. Key quickly mounted, pulling Eleanor up behind him. "Hold tight," she wrapped her arms around his waist as they rode. The terrain blurred around them, pine forest giving way to scrubland, then back to forest as they climbed higher into the mountains. It was nearly sunset when Key finally stopped, at a rocky outcrop overlooking the land they had traversed. Far below, the desert stretched toward Copper Springs, now invisible in the distance. "We should be safe for now," Key said, dismounting stiffly. Eleanor slid from the horse and insisted on examining his wound. The bullet had carved a furrow across his bicep. She tore a strip from her petticoat, cleaned the injury, and bound it tightly. "You shot well back there," Key observed. "Where did you learn?" "My father, before the drinking took hold," Eleanor replied. "He taught me when I was 12. Said every girl on the frontier should know how to defend herself. He taught you well." Eleanor sat back, suddenly overcome by the day's events. "I shot a man. 2 men. You saved my life," Key corrected quietly. "And your own." The simple truth settled over her like a mantle. She had indeed saved them both, not through chance or luck, but through deliberate action and courage she hadn't known she possessed. They made a cold camp that night, huddled beneath a shared blanket for warmth. In the moonlight, Eleanor studied Key's profile. The stern lines of his face softened slightly. "Why did you come back for me?" he asked, breaking the silence. Eleanor considered carefully. "Because you were willing to sacrifice yourself so I could escape. Because no one has ever done that for me before." "It was tactical," Key said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "It was bravery," Eleanor countered. "And I couldn't leave behind the only person who's treated me like I have value beyond what men want from me." Key was silent for a moment. "In my tribe, there's a saying, 'The eagle does not hunt flies.' It means a person of true worth doesn't concern themselves with petty things." "What does that have to do with me?" "You could have continued to safety, the easier path. Instead, you chose to return for someone others would consider beneath them, a Navajo, a stranger. You saw value beyond what your people typically recognize. You're not beneath anyone." Key Benelli. The next morning, they set out at dawn. By midday they had reached a high plateau where ancient pines gave way to meadows of wildflowers. The air was cooler, carrying the scent of pine and open spaces. "The Spanish road lies just beyond that ridge," Key said, pointing to a distant line of trees. "Another day's ride will bring us to the Stone Mission, then Perdido Canyon. Safety. And after that?" Eleanor asked. "That depends on what you want now." Eleanor considered this. 2 days ago, escape had been her only goal. Now, having tasted freedom, having fought for it, she found her vision extending beyond mere escape. "I want to build something," she said slowly, "not just run from something." Key nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's the true test of freedom, what you choose to create with it." As they stood on the ridge overlooking the path to their future, Eleanor felt a sense of completion. The woman who had left Copper Springs, frightened, uncertain, defined by others, was gone. In her place stood someone new, forged in the crucible of fear, choice, and action. She unpinned her hair, letting it fall loose around her shoulders. The wind caught it immediately, whipping it like a living thing finally unleashed. The Navajo believe that when a person faces death and survives, they are reborn, Key said. The old self dies and a new one emerges. Is that what happened to us back there? I think it began happening to you the moment you decided to leave your old life behind. The rest was just confirmation. They remounted and began the descent toward the Spanish road. As they rode, Eleanor thought not of what she had left behind, but of what lay ahead. Perdido Canyon, with its community of outcasts, the chance to use her knowledge of healing, the opportunity to define herself by her own choices. "What will you do?" she asked Key. "After you deliver me to Perdido Canyon?" He considered, his eyes on the horizon. "For 2 years I've lived to find justice for my sister's family. That path led me to Blackwood, which led me to you. And now? Now I find myself considering new paths. Perhaps it's time I too build something rather than simply avenge what was destroyed." The Spanish road stretched before them, curving away toward distant mountains. Eleanor touched the silver bracelet at her wrist, a talisman of her journey, a reminder of strength found when all seemed lost. "Then let's ride together," she said, her voice strong and clear, "and see where this path leads us both." Key nodded, a rare smile transforming his features. Together they rode forward, leaving behind not just Copper Springs and Sheriff Blackwood, but the very people they had once been. As they rode, the setting sun cast their single shadow long upon the ancient road. 2 figures merged into one, moving steadily toward the eastern horizon and whatever freedom awaited them there. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.